On recording. It is the hour, and so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome, everyone who's joined us. I'm Heidi Estrom. I'm the Associate Academic Officer at the State Board of Education. I'm delighted to introduce this session today, especially because I had almost nothing to do with it. This session has grown out of year-long conversations we've been having through our statewide Generative AI Alliance. This is an informal but lively group that has been coordinated through the Office of the State Board of Education, but really is fed by the energy and expertise at every institution. We've had an informal, this group wanted to host some statewide professional development. We had one more informal kind of share and learn opportunity earlier last month, or at the end of last month, and then we have another one coming up later in the semester. Today's session is a webinar that's recorded, and it's been organized by Jen Schneider and Amy Vecchione from Boise State. And then we have panelists, Randall from Idaho State, Reed Hepler from CSI, and Liza from College of Western Idaho. I am going to turn off my camera and slip out of the scene because the rest of this session is really run and coordinated by them. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Appreciate that introduction and just want to welcome everybody. We did turn the recording on. Thank you so much for that reminder. I also want to thank Amy Vecchione, who has her camera off. Amy and I are members of that statewide AI Alliance that Heidi mentioned, and we were really excited to get to organize this panel today, and Amy was essential in identifying the panelists, and they are awesome. So very happy that you're here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three speakers today, just so you have some context about where they're coming from and what they work on. I want to just encourage you, once we get into the presentations, to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom interface. There should be a Q&A button, and please go ahead and post your questions or comments for our panelists there, and we will make sure to get to them. So I'm going to start by introducing Reed Hepler. Reed is the Digital Initiatives Librarian, Copyright Agent, and Archivist for the College of Southern Idaho. Like most librarians, wearing many hats. So glad you're here. He has used his experiences in instructional technology, digital curation, copyright, records management, public communication, and database research to develop best practices guidelines for generative AI use. Reed promotes ethical, equitable, and open technology and information access, and advises on data privacy and confidentiality measures that should be at the forefront of generative AI interactions. Our second panelist is Liza Long. Liza is an assistant professor of English and former department chair of integrated studies at the College of Western Idaho. She loves to use AI to assist student learning in her English composition classes. And she actually wrote a literary analysis textbook called Critical Worlds with ChatGPT 3.5. And our third panelist is Randall. Ryan works as an instructional designer in ISU's Instructional Technology Resource Center. As an instructional designer, he works with faculty on how technology can promote learner engagement and active learning, as well as on accessibility and open educational resources, or OER. Ryan approaches AI tools as an enthusiastic skeptic, that is his term, and I like it a lot, based on his experience with digital humanities tools, his years as an instructional librarian, and his research in media and cultural studies. And I wanted to kick things off today with you three by having you each just talk for a couple of minutes about how you came to be interested in generative AI. We know it sort of burst onto the scene late in 2022 and captured a lot of users and imagination in early 2023. So maybe if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your entree into this brave new world. Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so I think for me, when I first started using tools of this sort, it was when I was doing more digital humanities work and doing library work. So this was actually before the moment that you're talking about when it sort of exploded. But when there were smaller tools, like the first one I remember using is actually called AntConc. And it's like Anthony's the last name of the developer. So it's AntConc. And conc is for concordance. And so you basically give it a corpus, one or as many texts as your computer can handle, and it will make an index of words that are related to each other mathematically. And so it generates those sort of concordances, those arrays of words that it thinks are likely to be paired with each other. And so it was an interesting way to approach humanities texts differently and see them through a different lens. And then also a lot of people I knew were doing things trying to associate massive levels of map data with new scans of old digitized maps. And so it was interesting to see how accurate they were. And so a lot of the way that I came to these sort of tools, where it was generating new possibilities, was simultaneously with the question of how accurate it is and what sort of labor could be saved or would end up being duplicated if the output was incorrect. So I think that's part of why I've ended up being that sort of enthusiastic skeptic model of when I came to using any of these sort of tools, it's often been a sort of, okay, it generates things that can be useful in certain circumstances, but it's surprising how often it ended up, in my experience in the past, where giving appropriate templates and proper training to an apt undergraduate or graduate student who's a work study student would actually have been a better use of funds and time than some of those tools, at least back then. So that's why when I see new tools, I'm always wondering, how do these compare and what are they well positioned for?
Yeah, I love that. Your comments are a reminder that, of course, artificial intelligence research just generally has been going on for 70, 80 years, and generative AI research really for around 10 years. And so even before ChatGPT sort of burst on the scene, folks like you were engaging with it, and some of those questions you were asking continue to be relevant now. Yeah, thank you so much for that. All right, Liza, how about you? How did you come into this space?
I guess I'm the odd person out since I'm the English professor. I want to start by thanking Heidi, Jen, you, and Amy. You all have been incredible with your leadership around AI, and it's been very much appreciated. And I'm also really grateful to be presenting with Ryan and Reed, who are so knowledgeable about these topics. I'm coming at this from the perspective of an English faculty member who learned about this in November 2022. I was department chair of integrated studies. I oversaw philosophy among other programs. And I was intrigued, but I was also incredibly nervous because I immediately thought, oh, great, this could potentially, students could use this to write papers. So I tested out our signature assignment for our Philosophy 103 class, and sure enough, ChatGPT could definitely write the paper. It got utilitarianism exactly right the first time. It wasn't right on Kant, but 3 weeks later, it got Kant right. And that was an interesting experience for me. So I started playing with it then, continued to use it. It became kind of part of my daily practice. And I was writing a textbook at the time, Critical Worlds, you mentioned, for an open education resource for my literary analysis course. And I thought, hey, I'm just going to see, how does this fit into my writing and research process? I deliberately chose to use Chat GPT 3.5, which is like giving yourself a handicap at this point. But I didn't know much about prompting. I didn't really know much about the tools. So what I love most, I've been very transparent and open in sharing my process. I love watching myself learn how to prompt. It's really interesting to see how bad I was at it in the beginning and how I get better and better over time. But one of the more useful things that I noticed is that Ryan already brought up is that it does get things wrong. And so I wanted to show that and model it for my students. Part of my book is a model AI essay, basically doing what I did with the utilitarian essay, but with the literary analysis. I have it write an essay on John Donne's The Canonization using different critical theories. And then I I go to town and explain all the ways that it's wrong, right? But I also highlight, here are the useful terms that you could use, and then we work through processes. I have students test this out themselves. So I've incorporated it in all of my classes at this point in various ways, but I was especially intrigued that this webinar focuses on privacy, because this should have been one of the first questions I asked myself. And unfortunately, my immediate ethical concern, or maybe fortunately, was climate change. That was the first thing I worried about. But I've become more and more worried about privacy the more I've learned. So I think it's really great that we're focusing on privacy issues today for instructors who are thinking about bringing in this into the classroom. And I hope to share a little later how I've addressed those concerns in my own classes while teaching with AI.
Yeah, thanks so much, Liza. And what I love about your story is I feel like it's a perfect explanation of the adoption curve that so many of us are going through right now, which is like, at first, we're primarily worried about academic integrity, sort of cheating issues. And then we're like, oh, how can we use this tool to teach students, since they're probably going to use it no matter what? And then what are the larger social ethical concerns around this technology? So that was really helpful to hear you talk about, and we will get to privacy here very soon. But Reed, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in and tell us a little bit about your trajectory with AI first.
So like many of you, I heard about it through different groups that I was meeting in. So a lot of people heard about it first through Marsh's essay in The Atlantic, the college essay is dead, that sort of thing. But I heard about it in my personal groups. I was hired by CSI initially to do OER things, and then it expanded to general digital initiatives. And in multiple of those groups, I heard a little bit about, ChatGPT. And to my regret, the first thing I thought was, that's never going to take off. Like, people are not going to use it. It's not going to be effective. And then, obviously now I work with it all the time. But it was kind of funny because I was in a faculty group to kind of introduce myself. I started work in October of 2023 at CSI, or 2022. And then the next month, ChatGPT was created and released. And on that day, I was introducing myself to the faculty senate. And right before I introduced myself, there were faculty who were talking about this new tool called ChatGPT, and it's going to, change the face of essay writing. And I was like, this is not going away. This is not going to be something that's going to be, a month long. And now, obviously, we have text generators, we have image generators, audio generators. This past month or 2 months, we even have music generators, which I've experimented with. But so from the very beginning, focused on how can I use this tool? And I mentioned my open educational resources background for this purpose. How can I use generative AI to create open access resources and make sure that information is being accessed openly, and that, and one of the first implications that I thought of was information access. But like Liza said, one of the first things I should have been focusing on was ethics and privacy and confidentiality. So it's really important that we're having this conversation. But it's kind of very interesting to think of it through the dual lens of, first of all, we want to make sure that information and these abilities are accessed by as many people as possible. But at the same time, we want the data in it to be, not accessed as widely as possible. We want to limit that. So there's kind of the problem of how do you promote access to the abilities, and how do you limit access to the data and focus on confidentiality. So that's what I've been working on, and I'm also focusing on the application of it in education, but also, of course, libraries and things like that. So that's what I've been focusing on.
I was just thinking about, the tech adoption cycle and early adopters and late adopters. And I was like, oh, there may be some parallels to the grief cycle here, where we're like, at first we're in denial and then we're into acceptance. That sort of reminded me of that when you were talking, Reed. Well, let's go ahead and pivot to privacy. And I just want to remind folks who are watching the webinar today to please post your questions in the Q&A function. It's a great opportunity to start to think through some of these issues for you in your classrooms or at your institutions. So, Reed, we'll just stick with you for a minute and maybe talk to us a little bit about why privacy feels like such an important topic for AI, even though all of us were like a little late to come to understanding the import of it. Talk to us about how you think about that issue.
So this really it starts with any service or app that you have that you download on your computer, or if you were a kid in the 90s, any computer game you put on your computer, you always put it in and you download it, and then it says read our terms of use. Or if you do Adobe, it says read our terms of use. And what do? You scroll all the way to the bottom and you say, yes, I've read it, even though you're lying and you haven't read anything at all. But that was where you understand, if you read OpenAI's terms of use and these tools' terms of use, you can see what data they keep, what data they don't keep, why they keep it or don't keep it. And it's something that a lot of people don't pay attention to until it affects them, or until they're afraid that it's going to affect them. That, hey, if I don't tell OpenAI that they can't use my data, they're going to use my data. It's the same thing with Facebook or Google when they released, here's our privacy policy. If you look at Facebook and you see, they used to have cool little icons, and it was kind of an adventure to see, what categories, what demographics does Facebook think I'm a part of? Now they don't have that as much. But it's the same thing with OpenAI and with these AI tools. They're using it the same way. And so it's very important because it can affect your life in ways you don't even know. OpenAI, especially if you use your Google account to have an account with ChatGPT like I do, it harvests all of that Google data and vice versa. So the things that ChatGPT is that you put in those prompts, it's going to be used by Google and by all these other providers. So the terms of use are really, if you look at that, you can see why it's so important to focus on privacy and actively putting in place measures and practices and steps to make sure that you're not putting your explicit data or extrapolatable data into your prompts. I also and you will note this, tend to ramble on until it becomes incoherent, but hopefully that answers your question.
That wasn't incoherent at all, but it did make me think, one of the challenges of maybe working with college age people on this is sort of the sense that, well, all technologies do this, all social media does this, Google's doing this, so why would I care extra about AI doing this? And maybe that's something we can get into a little bit as we proceed with our conversation today.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna go ahead and throw things to Ryan and have you talk to us a little bit about the privacy issue from your perspective, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that definitely I think about with the sort of media and cultural studies background is that question of why are we having access? Like, to whose benefit is it that we're getting access to this tool? So like going back to, there's a great sort of performance installation piece called Television Delivers People from the 70s that looks like it's basically just scrolling text. It was, I think, initially on New York Public Television, but it's an essay that sums up to television delivers people to advertisers. And that's sort of the model of American television. Other nations, like in Britain, you pay a television fee, so you can actually support the creation of the content. That's not how it works in the US, for better or for worse. That's why we have soap operas, because they were sponsored by the soap companies. But the question of the data, how long it persists, the question of what can be inferred or extrapolated, as Reed was saying, and how that can actually impact your life. So things like, we know that for people right now who are trying to get housing, if sometimes algorithms take into effect things like race or class or what profession you have. So there are currently real life effects that people experience based on calculations made by data. And these are things that it's difficult to perceive on a human scale, like a simple cause and effect. Like, I don't know that in Facebook, I liked this particular genre of music, or on some other streaming service, I mostly listen to R&B music. Therefore, the algorithm has decided I'm probably in this demographic, and therefore, for whatever computational reasons, it thinks I'm not as likely to make rent or to be able to afford my mortgage. Or if I do get the house, I'm going to have to pay increased fees. Like, people are currently experiencing these things. It's more egregious in other fields, but I think housing's one that many people can understand. And the data persists for so long that it gets out of your ability to remediate it if something goes wrong. So I still get mail for somebody who one of the credit card companies thinks we're the same person, but we have entirely different names, but I keep getting things from him, and I have a difficult time trying to convince them that I'm not him. I don't know what happened, but somehow some data files got conflated. I'm still dealing, thankfully it's just junk mail as far as I know. But these are the sort of, on a scale from mild annoyance to something that truly impacts what might be the biggest investment most humans make in their life. Data that's collected through services like these are sold to data brokers, and then you don't know what happens to it. So basically that sort of lack of informed consent that Reed was talking about, where you don't know what you're engaging in. The other thing, this is more minor, but I do wonder about, since most of the most popular generative AI tools use a text-based sort of back and forth, there's a thing that's been known since the mid-60s called the Liza effect, which is named after Eliza, which was this ELIZA tool that basically it was modeled after a certain type of psychotherapist, where basically whatever the user input into a little text box, it would turn into either a question or a statement. And so then people who were programmers who knew exactly what was happening realized that they found themselves being more likely to disclose things they wouldn't have otherwise. And they realized they sort of started to act with that interface, that experience, made it feel as though the computer actually had attributes they knew it could not have. They thought it was caring. They thought it was insightful. But they were programmers who knew that it wasn't. And so one of the things that, when it comes to privacy, makes me worried is that people will be much more likely to disclose things that would go against, when we're in education, we think about FERPA, we think about HEPA, we think about these things. Our providers that are not beholden to those things don't really care. And so I worry about how much we might be likely to be sort of swayed to act against our own interests by the interfaces.
Ryan, I feel like you just sort of articulated really compellingly the role of social engineering in all of this, right? And so there's a sort of training that's happening, not just for the machines, not just for the ChatGPTs or the DALL-Es, but of us. Like, we're being trained to trust, these interfaces in ways that maybe we should be a little bit more critical about. And then also, once the data is sort of sucked up into the machine and shared with others, there may be these real world effects, because there are things happening on the back end. There are sort of ghosts in the machine, and we don't always see the implications of those right at the beginning. So I'm really glad you articulated that. All right, Liza, you mentioned at the end of your sort of introduction that you came to the privacy issue later than you would have liked, but then you came to it with a lot of concern. And as somebody who's actively in the classroom right now and using these tools in the classroom, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what your main concerns are when it comes to privacy and why privacy is so important.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Ryan actually took it exactly where I wanted it to go, which is to FERPA. So when I started to have concerns, and to be clear, I never required students, even now I don't require students to use these tools in my class. I don't require them to set up accounts. I don't ethically feel good about requiring students to use these tools if they have what I think are very real ethical concerns about them. However, most of my students do use them and are happy for the guidance. So starting with FERPA, if there are any educators watching this or listening to the recording, however you use these tools, keep FERPA top of mind. Make sure that students never put any personally identifiable information into these tools. We, like Ryan and Reed were saying, we don't really know what happens with that. And similarly, let me give you a scenario, which is not a real world scenario. I want to make really clear, I've never done this, but let's suppose that I was grading an English 101 essay and that a student disclosed a very personal story about trauma in that essay, and that I decided that I wanted ChatGPT to help me assess the essay. So I copied and pasted the essay into ChatGPT. I personally think that's skating the limits of FERPA, right? We might not immediately stop and think, but Ryan used to teach the SIFT method for information literacy, and I've tried to do that same method whenever I make a choice about how to use ChatGPT or any other generative AI tool. I use a lot of them. I'm using more Copilot, to be honest, at this point. But I always stop first before I act, before I take any action that's related to work or to my students or to privacy. And I think, what are the potential implications of this? And circling back to what Reed said, I was an early adopter of social media as well. And when I got onto social media, I was like, yay, ways to play Scrabble with my siblings and share pictures of my kids with their grandmas. Pictures of my kids are all over the internet. I never once thought about that. And it's like the social engineering we're talking about. Yeah, we're trained to think these are friendly and helpful tools, and maybe they are helpful. They are for me, but what are the implications? Where is this going? And I have to say, the biggest aha moment for me, honestly, Jen, was when I realized that my own book had been scraped without my consent. Back to Ryan's idea of consent. The Atlantic published the book's 3 data set. You could plug your name in and see if your book had been scraped. And sure enough, mine had been, like with 183,000 other books. I'm really passionate about open education. I share all kinds of things under open licenses, but I did not consent to my book being used in that way. And I probably would have, right? But no one asked. It's that consent piece that was really, really troubling for me. So I use that SIFT model before I do anything related to privacy in the classroom. Now, a couple of practical tools for instructors who are thinking about using this. One thing that you can do is you could just use your own account, right? And have students in the class generate ideas, and then you're the one actually feeding it and prompting it. That's how I initially taught with it in spring of 2023. I've had the opportunity to be part of a pilot that I've loved with an ed tech tool called My Essay Feedback. I think I've talked about it before, but My Essay Feedback is built with privacy in mind for students. They do not have to create a ChatGPT account. It's built right into the LMS, and their responses and their papers are not shared out as part of the data set. So there are privacy protections built in for students. My students have all felt pretty comfortable working with the My Essay Feedback platform. And that's been a good way for them to get used to building their own prompts, basically using the tools as a writing buddy, which I think it can actually be very useful for, especially when you take that skeptical mindset that Ryan was explaining. I just finished grading a batch of 102 papers, and they were fantastic. They really showed, they acknowledged, they cited the use of generative AI, which I thought was very ethical. And it was really clear that they were not using it in ways that I thought were inappropriate. I know that's like our first biggest concern, but for my students, it was really helping them to shape their ideas and format their ideas. Another thing that has just been rolled out at my school that we are just now playing with is the Copilot. We are a Microsoft school, and so we have Copilot now for all of our students and for faculty. And it does have safety and privacy features built in. And one of the things, though, that's hard as an educator, I've always wanted my students to share the links to their chats. One of the things they can't do is share a link to a chat with the Copilot safety and privacy. So if I'm going to require that, they have to do screenshots. But yeah, so those are some ways I'm using it in the classroom right now. But I would just stress for any educators, use that SIFT mindset. Stop. Start with stop before you put anything into ChatGPT, and always keep FERPA top of mind.
Thanks, Liza. I wonder if you or Ryan maybe would be willing to just walk us through that SIFT model real briefly for folks who are wondering about that. I'd like to hear more.
I think Ryan's the pro. I'll let him do it.
I was hoping you would, because it's been so long I've been teaching it that I'm blanking on exactly what it stands for.
Reed put it in the chat, Ryan. It's stop,
Great.
Investigate, find better coverage, trace claims. And it's a good approach to ChatGPT.
Yeah. it's great to know that it's useful there too. But yeah, it's Mark Caulfield, who is at the University of Washington now. He's worked with a few other people to develop that method. And so it's a good sort of useful, it encourages lateral reading. It encourages some awareness of the sort of deeper contextual media ecology of like, okay, why would this particular venue frame it this way? Why would another venue frame it that way? Reading laterally lets you see all those different facets of a story and see how the same claim can be sort of phrased or shaped in different venues. And yeah, it's a really good, useful approach.
Thanks, Ryan. And
yeah,
Reed put the name of the book in there. It's called Verified by Mark Caulfield and Sam Weinberg for folks who are interested.
Yeah, I'll add another link. Some librarians in the state a few years ago, we made an OER that's trying to introduce that model to people. So I'll get that into the link. I'll get that into the chat box as well.
So just a reminder to our panelists that our attendees can't see the chat, but we are going to share out a list of resources with everybody at the end. So we'll make sure you all get that. And a reminder to post your questions into Q&A. With that, I would love to maybe switch a little to some more nitty gritty. I imagine there are administrators attending this webinar today and instructors too. And Liza, for folks who are new to thinking about this, you sort of quickly went through ChatGPT. There's ChatGPT 3.5, ChatGPT 4.0. You mentioned Microsoft Copilot. How should people who are just starting to think about this, or institutions that are just starting to think about these issues, like where do they begin? How do they begin? Some institutions are going to have access to Google, and some are going to have access to Microsoft, and some don't have institutional access at all. And so with the privacy issues in mind, what's your advice for getting started in an ethical and careful way?
That is such a good question, Jen. I've actually been really grateful to you and the folks at Boise State. I love your weekly updates and emails on AI because right now there's a fire hose of information. So if somebody's walking into this topic brand new, it can be really hard to know where to look. Finding trusted sources. I personally really like Mark Watkins, Lance Eaton, and gosh, I'm trying up the Wharton School, Ethan Mollick. Yeah, those three are people that I follow pretty closely to see what's going on. But in terms of getting started, I'm not the expert on this. I'm going to share where my campus, what we're striving for at CWI. So we are a Microsoft school, and we feel, and by we I mean myself and my colleague Joel Glad, we've had a lot of conversations about this. We feel that it would be easiest for us to have campus-wide conversations and to introduce our faculty, administrators, and staff to these tools if we had a common language. There are so many tools. I've used them all. They're like different flavors. They're good at certain things. I like Claude for some stuff. I like Google Gemini for other things. So there's a lot of different flavors. But our school has access to this now private and secured Copilot. And if you use the creative mode in Microsoft Copilot, you are getting access to ChatGPT 4, which is really probably the best of the large language models right now. Gemini is definitely trying to edge in there, but if you just use that, that's the tool that your school has. That's a common language for everyone to kind of see how it's working. I personally really, like I mentioned, like trying out different tools for different things. And we've done that in the classroom. One of the assignments that my students have worked on in groups is taking the exact same prompt and putting it into 3 different LLMs. And that can be a really interesting assignment for them to see how there are similarities and how there are differences. And it particularly illustrative was the difference between 3.5, ChatGPT 3.5 and ChatGPT 4.0. It's, again, if you're using 3.5, if your students are using it, it's come a long way. I use the analogy for my students. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Coinstar, right? But you go dump all your coins into the machine at the grocery store, and you hear jingle, 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 jingle. It takes a little while, and it says, okay, here's your money. Well, that machine actually calculates the amount of money instantly, but they found that people did not believe that it was correct because it was so fast. And I realized that OpenAI, in releasing ChatGPT 3.5, had kind of nerfed their tool as well. So they wanted us to have an experience where it was wrong and it did hallucinate, and we felt a little more comfortable with it. And they were also testing us to see how we interacted with the tool before they really released tools that were really superior to 3.5. So if 3.5 is your only experience, I guess that would be, to answer your question, Jen, I would say find a way to try the more advanced tools. And having a common language, I think, can be helpful. We're hoping at CWI that having a common language around Copilot with students and faculty and staff will help us to better be able to talk about issues like privacy with these tools.
And just for folks, again, who might be new to these conversations, LLMs is large language models, and there are a bunch of different large language models competing out there. They're trained differently on different types of data sets, and it feels like they have different personalities. And Reed was sort of in a side conversation earlier saying, it's funny how do we talk about like a ChatGPT or a Copilot or a Bard or Gemini as a she, a her, a they, an it? In what ways might we be personifying our interactions with the robots? And how does that impact how we think about them? Ryan or Reed, I wonder if you have any recommendations. Are there particular types of systems or LLMs that you think are better on privacy than others? Or is it too soon to make a statement, or is it changing too quickly?
So I can go first, and then Ryan, you can go second. But I do want Ryan, you can talk about this. I personally prefer OpenAI ChatGPT only because they're transparent and they have stuff in their terms of use, and they explicitly do not like say that we don't extrapolate data, or they work against that. If you ask Perplexity or Claude, they evade the question. And then if you ask Google or Bing, they will tell you not only that they do it, but they will also tell you how to do that. Like it's kind of weird. But so that's personally who I use. And I also want to say kind of about Liza, about her comments about having a unified and consistent language. One of the ways that I would do that is to be device and service agnostic in how you talk about AI literacy in a framework. I know that, with a Microsoft or a Copilot institution, you can't really do that. But a lot of people, even if your institution only uses Microsoft, other people are going to use different tools. And so one of the things that I've been doing is try to use the most general terms and speak broadly in terms of input, output. Don't talk about, chats with ChatGPT, like ChatGPT does this or whatever. Say the tool does this, or the generative AI tool does that, and probably semantics in some cases. But try to be device agnostic, and service agnostic in how you talk about these things. But so yes. So to answer your immediate question, ChatGPT is who I would use for a lot of reasons.
Thanks, Reed. And there's a lot of good resources being shared in the chat. Ryan, do you have any thoughts on sort of particular services over others for privacy?
The one that I'm most excited about, Mozilla, who make Firefox and other things, they're making it easier and easier to actually run them locally on your own computer. And so that's where I'm most excited. The one I talked about at the beginning, that little concordance generator, is another one that similarly, I was excited to use it because it works on my own machine, so I know where the data goes. And what I would love to have happen would be, I know some schools like University of Michigan are already making it so that they run these tools locally for their own campus community instead of using one that's an outside service provider. And I would hope somewhere between each individual user can have access to what they decide to use on their own computer, through to a whole campus gets a certain access that they can trust has been sort of trained with the least amount of bias in the data sets that they know went into it. So that's sort of maybe a little more prospective, like future oriented, but those are the things I'm excited about personally.
Okay, so we're still waiting for questions to come in, but so I'm gonna just maybe put you three on the spot a little with some specific practical questions that people might be wondering. Is it okay to upload student work to one of these platforms? So in other words, Liza, you gave the example earlier, somebody turns in an essay, an instructor has a stack of 60 essays to grade, and they're like, well, what would ChatGPT say about this essay? Can I copy and paste a student essay into any one of these platforms and say, what feedback would you give this student? So I see a lot of
No,
shaking heads. So we'll do Liza and then Ryan. So for you, Liza, it's a clear no.
not without consent. So I won't say no, but absolutely not without transparent consent, not 64-page terms of service for your students. But do I have your explicit permission to do X with your paper, and be really explicit? And for some reason, I said I came late to the privacy game, but I guess I always understood that piece of it, that it just was not going to be acceptable for me to upload student work without their consent. Early on, I did have consent from students to like upload a paragraph to help with grammar and syntax corrections, for example. And we found that to be really useful, but I always made sure I had explicit consent. And I would recommend that for anyone who's thinking about using it in this way. Now, again, the tool that I use, my essay feedback, that the consent piece of it is explained to students right at the beginning. And so they know that their work's going to be uploaded there, that the AI will review it, and that I will also be reviewing it. And a fun thing about that particular tool is I get to design the prompts. So I can chunk my essays. A lot of us do that who are writing instructors. We do little bit-sized pieces, and we can work iteratively on those papers. It's not just a whole paper all at once. And I get to custom design those. But yeah, I would never, ever copy and paste any student work without explicit permission from the student. And I mean written. So.
Okay, so your answer is actually a qualified yes. If they have a simple, clear consent form the student has signed or agreed to,
and can opt out.
And can opt out, and you're being
Yeah.
clear with them about what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
So you would never sort of just upload student work, have the machine grade it, and then return those grades or feedback. Okay.
No, I wouldn't. But I will say I did get some permission from students in my mythology seminar to test this out for grading. And it can be helpful in that way for instructors who are thinking about doing this. Again, get consent. But what I found was it didn't actually save me time, but it really helped with my cognitive load, because as an English instructor, I always worry, well, am I really being fair and objective? And just having that grading buddy, that's kind of how I think of it. You know, like I would come up with my own view of the paper first, and then I'd put it into the grading buddy, again with consent. And if I saw the same things and I felt validated, and I guess I felt less bad. I just need to move to a grading contract, to be honest, and not assign grades to work anymore. But yeah, it helped me to feel a little more confident in my own grading, and that I was being more objective. So, but again, with student permission.
Ryan, did you want to jump in on that? You had a strong reaction to the question as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for higher ed things, the most accurate answer is almost always it depends. But so certainly not without explicit consent, something like a memorandum of understanding, which is what I'm thinking of when I look at you, Liza, because I know you got that for working on some of your open ed materials with students. But among the things that I would worry about with that, not only would be the student privacy and what you disclose without the student's permission, but also any sort of engagement with students that encourages a transactional relationship, as opposed to one that encourages, this is the way of knowing that we develop and we grow into while working in this particular discipline. And the more that you would rely on an outside tool, I think the less trust you'd have with the student if they knew that you did it. And also you're just taking opportunities away from yourself to show students your sort of disciplinary epistemology, your sort of disciplinary way of thinking and approaching claims or facts or other things. And so I would be very reticent unless so the one bit of it depends that sort of struck my mind is if it's a course which is about technology. So like if it were a digital humanities course If it is a sort of business communications course, even sort of a first or second year course in a field where it's likely that the students are going to be doing that in the future, and you want to help them develop the skills and understanding that's appropriate, then with their permission, I could see doing it, but I personally would always steer towards modeling the engagement as opposed to sort of using it as a way to have the engagement go faster on your end.
So yeah, that's really helpful because you all mentioned FERPA earlier, and I'm sure that made some instructors like head explode. Like, I thought it just meant I couldn't talk to a student's parents about their grades, and now I'm supposed to figure out, you know, the relationship between Copilot and FERPA. What I hear you saying is just put consent first, and then you're probably always okay when it comes to thinking about doing things in an ethical, relationship-rich way. Yeah, that's good. So here's another hot button question for you all. And maybe this kind of gets us up to the institutional level. I'm sure there's some administrators here today. So, you know, we're hearing a lot about not only should we engage with some of these tools, but we must engage with them because increasingly there's going to be a digital divide where there are students who are going to need to have training in generative AI in order to be successful in the workplace. And there are those who won't be able to pay for it or won't have educational access and who will be left behind. That's one of the narratives we have here. And so given the privacy issues, how should institutions be thinking about whether or not students should be required in classes, say, to use some of these platforms? And what do you do with students who decline to use them? I wonder if you have thoughts about that, any of the three of you.
Is it okay if I start, you guys? I have a lot of thoughts because I've been doing this. Okay. So these issues are challenging. I will say that these tools have the potential to really improve digital equity for all the reasons you were mentioning, Jen, right? That like if it could either make it worse or it could make it better, right? So I think we want to be very intentional about how we approach these tools in terms of making it better. An article I read that's top of mind for me when I think about this, the ACT in December, they surveyed students to see who was using these and how. And I think it's not coincidental that the top scores on the ACT, which is a closed system test, students cannot be using ChatGPT when they're in that test, right? The top quartile were also by far the biggest users of these tools, self-reported users. And so that's an area where we might see students who are more technologically savvy or digitally advantaged, taking advantage of these tools to really become that writing buddy, that study buddy. It really has great potential in that way. You know, if you treat it that way and you learn how to use it as a tool like that, you basically have a 24/7 tutor sitting there with you, helping you. And so these top scores on the ACT have figured that out. And it's maybe the bottom scores who need it, but they're the ones who aren't using these tools. My students are mostly, when they come to my class, very afraid of being accused of plagiarism. So wherever you come from, I would say making sure you have a very clear syllabus policy about AI use in your classroom, and that you've already thought about how you're going to deal with situations where you have unauthorized use. That's going to be really important for all instructors, regardless of your ideological position on these tools. Are they going to be used in the workplace? Yes, they're being used right now. Are we benefiting students if we teach them how to prompt and how to use these tools? My personal opinion is yes, we are benefiting students. And we have a unique opportunity at this point in the technological shift, and it's a big one, to shape the ethics of our students, how they engage with these tools, how they think about them, to be more digital skeptics like Ryan, to not outsource their thinking. What I often tell my students is if you use these tools to augment your thinking and work, that's awesome, but they should not replace your thinking and your work. So we have to think very intentionally about how we're teaching them in the classroom. I do have an opt-out assignment for all my students, and I use these are assignments that are graded. They're lovely, actually. The My Essay Feedback ones are auto-graded, so they just have to complete the assignment, interact with the AI, and boom, it's in my gradebook. But the opt-out for the students on those weekly writing tasks is that they just have to meet with a tutor at the writing center and do the same assignment, right? So they're doing exactly the same assignment. They're just not working with the AI. They're working with the writing tutor. In the full time, and I make it really clear that I don't care, whichever one. I've only had one student though of all my students who's taken me up on that. So most of my students are actually really eager once they learn that they're going to get guidance. They want to know from their instructors how to use these tools. We have this opportunity to shape their views around privacy, about what's appropriate to share in these tools, about ethics, about, again, my number one concern is and always has been climate change from the energy use of these tools. I guess I was reading Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson when I was working with AI, and I was like, oh, this is not a good technology. But I did ask it, just so you all know, if you're worried, I asked ChatGPT and it said that AI would solve that problem, so I shouldn't worry. So I'm good.
Oh, phew. Oh, good.
Yeah, no self-serving answer at all in that. But yeah, so I mean, like that's like to sum up, I think we still have reasonable ideological conversations, and I had many of them as department chair that oversaw philosophy. We have faculty who are 100% ideologically opposed to the use of these tools. And I think for me, at least, it's an academic freedom issue to not allow those conversations to occur. So even though I'm very pro AI and I could go on and on about all the benefits of this to students, I do see it as a digital equity builder when it's used correctly. I also think that this has been sprung on us all very quickly, typical of technology, without maybe the ethical conversations that should have happened beforehand. And so to shut down those conversations, I think would be a bad idea for any institution. I would not recommend that administrators do that. I think we need to be having robust conversations about these tools.
Thanks, Liza. Ryan, Reed, in the few minutes we have remaining, did you want to add anything to Liza's comments?
I think the main thing I'd add is with any sort of tool, I mean, I'm very much a proponent of what one might call, educating for an uncertain future. And so making sure that people are prepared to think of how to make a good life for themselves and for others in what they think is appropriate in an uncertain future. And so with this tool, just like any other, it's important for educators to think that through. And I think were one to have a required course engagement with a tool, think about, like Liza has done, what alternatives would still meet the appropriate learning outcomes for that course, and what's appropriate for one discipline would be different from another. And if it's, for instance, a communications course where it is extremely likely someone will be doing this in their own future, perhaps that would be a point where in a few years, there could be a few on-campus machines that are dedicated for, they run this, maybe it's not as robust as the commercial one, but here's a few places where we could have the data stay on our campus. And it's just sort of a lockdown, analogous to a lockdown browser for a testing center. This is how you can engage in a way that all the data stays on our campus. So hopefully we can imagine ways that would still allow students to engage and to get the feedback that they need when things go off the rails, which is what learning entails. So.
Yeah, that's right. This isn't totally new to us, right? We've been teaching students how to engage with the internet, for example, for a really long time now.
Yeah.
Reed, did you want to jump in?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I love what Liza and Ryan have already said about this. And one of the main things that they both brought up was Liza mentioned that once your students were informed and knew about the AI, they were eager to learn. And then Ryan, you mentioned that we're educating people for an uncertain future and that they may need to know how to do this in their jobs. And so really kind of, even though, the SIFT method may not be seem at first glance to be appropriate or relevant, it is, because it all comes back to AI literacy, learning about the AI. And once you know about AI tools and about their functions and about how they can affect you, you can use them, and first of all, you'll feel more confident using them. And second of all, you'll know how you should and should not be using them. One of the main things that I focus on is making sure that people are informed. And we talked about consent, having informed consent. If you have to read 5 pages of terms of use, if your students have to do that, make sure they read it, give them the link, and kind of throw the book at them. You know, I always, whenever my instructors would, you know, give me, you know, the 5 articles per week to read, I was like, oh no, this again. But it's useful. And especially with AI, in terms of AI literacy, students have to read, have to have the experience. So give them the experience, give them the readings, and help them become AI literate. And then they will know how to navigate the privacy and confidentiality and data issues. In addition to those lockdown servers and things that Ryan was saying, you know, have practical solutions. But like he said, when the learning does go off the rails, when they do experiment and explore, if they have good practices and best practices and are literate about AI, they will be able to take care of themselves, or they'll know who to reach out to.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Reed. And I put a link to the SIFT method in the chat that I think, Reed, you provided above. So thanks so much for that. Heidi, I'm going to go ahead and see if you're available to maybe unmute and turn your camera back on. I know we're reaching the top of the hour here, and just wanted to see if you wanted to say anything as we wrap up.
I just sent a comment. This was amazing, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate the resource document that you all put together as well. I think this topic of data and ethics is an important one, and I'm glad that this is one of the topics that surfaced to highlight. And I really appreciate the contributions of each of you. That was really important. Thank you. And then,
No, thank you.
And then the other thing is to watch your email for the next professional development conversation that's coming around AI. If you haven't received that, feel free to reach out to me. But those should have gone out through your campus communication processes. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks.